Let's talk about the persuasive essay outline activity. This document has been attached in an email that I sent to you, and you will use it to prepare for the persuasive essay itself. So let's walk through it so you have some idea what's involved in terms of this outline particularly. First of all, you notice there's a space for you to jot down information regarding the introduction. The whole idea behind this space is just to get some ideas out there. You might not fill all of this in immediately, and you definitely do not have to fill this outline out in order. So for example, in terms of your hook, me personally, I wouldn't fill this out first. I like to come up with my hook when I'm writing my paper, or I write down a bad hook and go back and put a good one in later. It's up to you how you want to do that. So if you don't want to fill that in, I can understand that. In terms of background information, this is the type of information that your reader will need to understand before they can comprehend your thesis and the direction you're taking your paper. So an obvious one here is to identify the issue that you're writing about. So if you want to write about immigration policy, then you need to explain what the problem is with immigration policy. If you're writing about child marriage in this country, and then you need to identify that as the problem you want to discuss. This is really not as high-tech as it sounds. You just want to make sure that in the intro, you don't accidentally overlook identifying your problem. Number two, you need to frame your problem in measurable terms. And when we say measurable terms, we mean quantify it somehow. How can you use numbers to help your reader understand the problem? If we're talking about the number of people who are underage and married in this country every year, perhaps we're talking about a number of immigrants who are entering the country illegally versus illegally, that sort of thing. Whatever numbers you think make sense for your topic in particular. Number three, consider this. What are you asking your readership to do or to think? Are you looking for a change in attitude and belief or action? You're filling this one out basically so you can maintain your focus. It doesn't mean you should have an actual sentence in the introduction that says the readers of this paper should change their attitude or the readers of this paper should change their belief. Instead, that change should be implied in your introduction. I should have a pretty good idea by the time I'm done reading your introduction if you're looking for me to vote for someone in particular to be president, or if you're looking for me to just become more aware of a certain problem that's in this country, or if you're trying to change my attitude because you know there are a lot of people who feel a certain way about your topic. If I were going to be writing about immigration policy, I might try to argue that that policy should soften up on how we deal with illegal immigrants, or perhaps I want to say that that policy should take a harder stand. But mostly what I'm looking for is for my reader to maybe see that topic in a new light. I might be just addressing attitude. So when we get to the thesis, this of course is the most important sentence in the essay. We're looking for number 4 here. What is the position you are taking? Are you for or against something, or you believe something should be done, or you believe we need to recognize something as a problem? And number 5, for what outcome or for what reason are you taking this position? So again, if I'm going to be talking about immigration policy, I might say that we need to understand where illegal immigrants are coming from, so that we don't become a people who are xenophobic, a people who blindly send people out of this country into harm's way. And maybe there's a third main point, but those are my reasons for taking this position. So if you're taking the position that child marriage should be completely outlawed in this country, what are your reasons for that? Is it because of the rights of minors? Is it because of abuse in the lives of young people? Is it because of maybe concealing the crimes of some people, because there are cases where people who've committed rape are protected. The villain is protected because the parents force the child to enter into a marriage. So anyway, that's the idea with the introduction. Ideally for this paper, since this is a 4 to 5 page paper, your introduction might be about half a page. So maybe 6 sentences, maybe 7, somewhere in that vicinity. In terms of the body of your paper, you should have 3 main points. So main point number 1, give us one of the reasons for your position. Now we've already listed those, I would hope, in number 5 in the intro. What are your reasons for taking this position? So one of those 3 reasons should be main point 1. There's a space here for you to practice writing your topic sentence. What is your central claim? So your claim might be that child marriage should be outlawed because it is psychologically and emotionally abusive for children to be forced into marriage by their parents. So that would be my claim for my first main point, and that would certainly be listed up here. Okay, moving on to page 2. So here's how I have arranged for your main points in terms of an outline. I've given you a space here to put down a piece of evidence. This might be a statistic, it could be a quotation, or perhaps some paraphrase material, but evidence comes from your research, something that you have found in your research that you're using to prove your point. So if I'm trying to prove that children are abused psychologically or emotionally when they enter into a child marriage, then I need some evidence for that. I need to find evidence in my research. And then 2B is where I interpret or explain that evidence. So what am I going to do with that evidence? I can't just quote evidence and walk away. In your essay, you're responsible every time you use evidence to explain what it means. So there's room here for 1 piece of evidence, 2 pieces of evidence, 3 pieces of evidence. I would hope that for each main point, you would have at least 3 pieces of evidence. Sometimes you might have 4, sometimes you might only have 2, but I've given you room for 3 on the outline, so use those spaces as you need. You should never have just 1 piece of evidence for each main point, though. So I've given you room for 3 pieces of evidence. At the bottom of each main point, you'll see a number 5 called forms of persuasion. And we've just started to touch on these 3 forms of persuasion. And a lot of you in class were familiar with them already. And some of these you'll use pretty automatically. But I'd like us to start thinking about how we're using them. So you might not fill these out immediately. You might fill out this part of the outline actually like when you're working on your rough draft. It just sort of depends on what your process is. But I'd like you to be able to label how in main point number 1 are you using logos, or in other words, how are you using logic? How are you using logic in terms of statistics or facts? How are you using logic in terms of explanations, or perhaps an analogy or a comparison? Secondly, how are you using ethos? This means how are you earning credibility with your readership? The number 1 way you will do that is by quoting good sources. So if you're quoting good sources, you automatically get this one. The third one might not appear in every main point. The third form of persuasion is pathos. And pathos is an emotional appeal. It's a way of getting your reader to care about what you're saying. You'll use logos to help your reader understand, ethos to help your reader trust you, and pathos so the reader cares about the subject. You'll probably use pathos if you're sharing a story or an anecdote about a specific situation. That might not happen in every main point. That might only happen in 1 main point, and that's okay. You don't need to use pathos every time. But I have given you a space here. If you're using an emotional appeal in main point 1, you can explain what that is. Now for main points 2 and 3, I've given you the exact same spaces. There's a place here to write your second reason for taking your position. So if I'm writing my paper about child marriage and my first main point was that it's psychologically and emotionally abusive, and my second main point is that that child marriage is used to hide the crimes of terrible people, like perhaps a rapist, then that might be my second main point. That might go here. So I have room for my claim, And I again have room for 3 pieces of evidence and the interpretation of that evidence. And there's a spot at the bottom where I can explain where logos, ethos, and or pathos are being used. The same thing goes for main point 3. There's room for my third reason, room for a claim, room for evidence and interpretation. When you get to the end of this form, you'll find the conclusion section. I've given you a space here just to write out some sample statements that you might want to use to refocus your paper. It's time for us to stop using the term in conclusion at the beginning of our conclusion. It's a little on the nose and is actually a little insulting to a readership. It's sort of like telling your reader that they're not really bright enough to figure out your paper's ending. So instead, we just want a statement that refocuses on the subject holistically. So something about, for my example here, child marriage that just says perhaps child marriage continues to be a problem, and until someone stands up and changes the law, it will always be a problem. That's a kind of generic, broad statement I could use to refocus my paper. Then I need to review my main ideas. I can review my 3 main ideas in fresh language, hopefully. What kind of conclusions can I draw about those? And then I have room for closing statements, or perhaps even closing questions. Sometimes a good essay answers questions, and sometimes it just raises better questions in the end. I've also given you a checklist here for your works cited list to make sure that you're doing it correctly, make sure it's alphabetized, to make sure you're using hanging indent, make sure you've included all the necessary pieces of information, that sort of thing. So then at the bottom, for each body paragraph, just some reminders. When you actually get around to writing that rough draft, make sure you have a topic sentence, make sure you explain it, make sure you introduce your sources, make sure you cite source material correctly, quotes, paraphrases, that kind of thing. Make sure you always interpret or explain source material. So I hope that this outline is helpful. Treat it like a worksheet. If you need to scratch things out and rewrite things, and if it's an absolute mess, don't worry about it. I would like to see the outline next week. I'm going to create a place on Blackboard where you can turn it in. I would like to review the outlines, and if I have questions for you, I will email you and ask you about those things. Otherwise, you'll get an email from me that tells you you have the green light for writing your rough draft. So the sooner you submit the outline, the sooner you will hear back from me. But if you want to wait until next Thursday, October 22nd, that would be just fine with me too. Okay, if you have questions about the outline, please let me know. Thanks.